At first I was supposed to be flown back to Germany in a Storch, but there were so many soldiers who needed the transport more urgently and sooner than I did. I was thus in the main dressing station for another 2 days. During their daily visits, my comrades reported all the news that had happened to our unit. They told me that Lieutenant Eichhorn had not moved back on that night, and that on the next day he had let himself be misled into frontally attacking a village, which was occupied by strong Russian tank forces. Of course, he had been repulsed. Eichhorn was a superb officer, but he still lacked the necessary experience. He had only been in the company for a short time after he, a former paymaster, had voluntarily attended the school for armour forces. The men also related how he had only reached the Rollbahn, which Ivan already controlled with his tanks, to Riga with great difficulty. The unit had run the gauntlet between Stalin's and T-85S. Only one Tiger had reached the bridge over the Duna, which was already under enemy fire. Our company had more casualties, dead and wounded, on this one unlucky day than in all previous operations. The men who could get out of their burning tanks had to swim across the Duna to get to safety. Our company never recovered from this severe bloodletting. Nienstedt and Eichhorn were soon wounded, and new officers arrived who weren't so close to the troops. Major Schwaner was also later replaced by a commander who was a complete failure. The rest of our tanks were farmed out individually and were lost one after another. With a heavy heart, I went back to the homeland. I was loaded on a ship in Reval. The Russians had already broken all rail connections. After 14 days, I arrived in Germany. In Swinemünde, we were put on wonderfully clean hospital trains. For the first time in a long time, I lay in fresh, white sheets, almost too good for a common soldier such as myself. When I arrived in Lingen on the Ems, I weighed all of 87 pounds. At that time, I didn't believe I would be making my first attempts at walking by the end of September. It was in the hospital that I first read in an old newspaper that a fellow soldier had brought with him that I had been awarded the Oak Leaves on July 27, 1944. I was the 535th soldier of the Wehrmacht to receive that award. Of all the untold good wishes from the front and from home, I enjoyed the letters that my company sent me in the hospital the most of all. Of those, I especially enjoyed the writings of my fatherly friend, the term that I really must apply to our Stabsfeldwebel. I was always up to date on the company through his letters. Rieger had written quite guardedly to my mother when he couldn't find out anything definite about me. He wanted to determine whether I had made it home alive. We were corresponding with one another shortly thereafter. It still makes me happy today that my mother put away and saved all correspondence from that time. In the first lines I sent to the company from the hospital, I asked whether Kircher, Kramer, Göring and Lonecker had received the awards I had requested for them while still at the main dressing station. In response to that, I received the following reply from Rieger on September 5th. Göring, Kircher and Kramer haven't been submitted yet. There is no longer an officer in the company who will pursue the matter. I wrote to the battalion by return post and received the following good news on November 17th. Feldwebel Kircher and Unteroffizier Kramer have been awarded the Knight's Cross, Oberfeldwebel Göring the German Cross in gold. The concerns that burden you have been eliminated by the presentation of these awards. I am especially proud that they are the first sergeants of the battalion to whom this high decoration has been awarded. My recovery actually proceeded too quickly. The doctor determined that my upper thigh bones had already become so set during the 14 days my medical evacuation lasted that an adjustment of their length appeared impossible. Despite that, I was still put in a Thomas stretch splint. That was a fine affair. Despite all efforts, however, my leg remained shorter. I was just happy that it had set so quickly. One morning I received a letter with the return address of Department P5 of the OKH, also known as the Medal Department. In it, I was asked to report my ability to walk so I could be ordered to Hitler's headquarters for the official award of my Oak Leaves. I replied, asking whether they couldn't also send me this award. The answer? Because the Führer has reserved to himself the right to hand out the Oak Leaves, a transmittal of the award through the Home Front High Command of the 6th Army Corps is not possible. As soon as you are able to personally report to the Führer, you need to report that to OKH/PA/P5 in a timely fashion, so that an appropriate report can be initiated here. The only aspect about these laconic lines that made me happy was the short, handwritten greeting at the bottom, "With best wishes for a speedy recovery, Johann Meyer Major." I thus discovered that this superb man was still alive. We had given up hope on him at Newell. In the middle of September, I made the first attempts at walking after the weights had been removed from my leg. Walking on crutches has to be learned, however. I made this unfortunate discovery during my first excursion. It was, of course, a forbidden flight to a certain locale. Everyone looks forward to this place after they have been chained to a bed for a long time. Of course, I wanted to go down the first step, leg first, instead of with the crutches. I promptly fell, naturally on the injured leg. My first thought was that my thigh bone, which hurt like hell, had been broken again. Besides everything else, the doctor would make short work of me. But I was lucky. The medic brought me back to bed. Walking went better the next day. Through hard training, I reached a point after 14 days where I could walk with 2 canes. After another 14 days, I was down to 1 cane. I then sent off my report that I was ready to roll. I was eager to learn when I would be ordered to the Führer's headquarters. I wanted to see, once and for all, what the mood was there, as I had already had my doubts about the successful conclusion of the war for some time. At the end of October, I was ready. I was ordered to Salzburg, where I was to report to the local commander for additional instructions. Travelling by train was no longer a simple procedure. The Lingen-Salzburg route wasn't exactly short either. Our train didn't even enter Salzburg. The final stop was a small station in the suburbs. I shaved to get myself inspection ready. Suddenly, there was an air raid alarm. Everybody ran into the air raid shelter, except for 2 other soldiers and me. We looked at the bomber formations out in the open. They were flying a straight course in neat formations toward Munich, seemingly unfazed by the well-represented anti-aircraft guns. Their fire no longer even had a psychological effect. The bombers returned on the same route a short time later. Only one straggler flew somewhat low. He appeared to be hit. We wanted to witness its demise, but the plane suddenly dropped its bombs scarcely 100 meters in front of us. Apparently he had been saving them for Salzburg. We quickly lay with our noses pressed to the dirt, but emerged with only a scare. The bomber got the worst end of the deal. It was hit by flak and slammed into the mountains. However, my inspection uniform looked as if I had just come directly from the front. My suspicions were confirmed at the city commander's office. The Führer's headquarters wasn't in this area at all. Himmler was scheduled to give out the decoration, and his staff was located in a suburb of Salzburg. Himmler wasn't just the leader of the SS. He was also the head of all police, the Minister of the Interior, and the commander of the replacement army. All the officers were housed in a special train located directly in front of a tunnel. During air raid alerts, it was shunted inside. I had envisioned the guards being more exacting, but 2 sentries made their rounds on each side of the train and didn't even ask us for our identification papers when we climbed onto the train steps. The army liaison officer, a major, attended to me and directed me to a compartment in the guest car. He said I didn't need to hurry since my meeting with Himmler wouldn't occur for another 2 days, at a minimum. He also mentioned that the commander of the 1st Company of the 502nd, Oberleutnant Bolter, had departed a day before. He had received the oak leaves 3 months after I did and had also come to that location for the award. It was very upsetting that I had missed him. To this day I have never seen him again. I was then a guest of the staff. All the officers were happy whenever they had a visit, because they could then attack the bottle of schnapps reserved for honouring the guests. Himmler was very strict. He didn't drink alcohol himself. Everyone, from the general down to the lieutenant, had to peel their own boiled potatoes during meals. The major guided me through the various sections of the train. I was amazed that so many offices were housed in the cars. Of course, one question interested me the most. What course will the war take, and what do they think about it here? Many new weapons were being shown in movies. Jets and manned anti-aircraft rockets. There were so many reports of volunteers to crew the rockets that only a small portion could be used. I saw these reports on the volunteers with my own eyes. It was intended to bring down several bombers simultaneously with these rockets. Other items shown included remote-controlled anti-aircraft bombs, new types of poisonous gases, taboon, and submarines that couldn't be detected by sonar. There were also night vision devices for tanks and long-range bombers capable of reaching America. The smashing of the atom was also portrayed through a model. This was a process I couldn't grasp with my knowledge at the time, only understanding it after the war during my studies. I also learned that heavy water was required for this process. Through treachery, our factory in Norway had fallen victim to an attack. Even the 2 railcars that were saved were blown sky high on the ferry meant to bring them to Germany. It was claimed that this loss set us back at least 2 years. As a result, the eastern and western fronts had to be kept clear of the German borders for at least a year. The details of the assassination attempt of July 20th, 1944 were also discussed. For me, the only true resistance fighter was Graf Stauffenberg. Initially an enthusiastic frontline officer, he became acquainted with the actual situation of the war after his wounding and subsequent assignment to the Führer's headquarters. He decided to act and followed his convictions. It is noteworthy that it was a proven frontline officer, of all people, who took action and sacrificed himself for his convictions. He was among the most capable general staff officers in the army. Additionally, he had lost his right hand, part of his left, and also an eye through wounds. The fact that Graf Stauffenberg didn't join the resistance group until late illustrates the indecisiveness of others who had planned an assassination since 1938, but never found an executioner. In all those years, no one was found who could simply draw his pistol and fire the decisive shot. Almost all of us frontline soldiers believed that we were risking our lives for something good and that we would win the war, but no one knew for certain. The leaders of the resistance groups were convinced that their sacrifices would benefit the fatherland and that only the timely liquidation of Hitler could save Germany. This is based on statements from survivors and the judgment of biographers. Every soldier is expected to put his life on the line for his country during war, without questioning whether he will sacrifice himself for a good cause or one that promises success. Why, then, should we relieve the men of the resistance groups of their obligation to act in a timely and ruthless manner? They knew their deeds and sacrifices could only save Germany if they acted promptly. What would have happened if Hitler had indeed been killed on July 20th, 1944? What hopes could Germany have placed in these men who, after so many years, couldn't devise a successful plan to eliminate Hitler? The conspirators would never have been in control. The Allies, as can be proven, were the laughing third party who were never ready to offer guarantees to the resistance group. The hatred of the Western world, and the even more justifiable hatred of the Russians, didn't just apply to Hitler. It applied to the entire German population as well. Just look at the treaty at Yalta and the negotiations that led to it. Whoever wants to start a revolution must place all bets on one card. Otherwise, they must give up the rebellion and submerge among the army of gripers and saboteurs who are, have been, and will always be present in every state and regime. Every decent combat soldier will resist, rightly so, the notion that secret grumbling and treacherous sabotage are valued higher than risking one's life at the front, especially when survivors and those privy to the resistance groups often allowed modesty, characteristic of true idealists, to disappear after 1945. Unfortunately, the men executed after July 20th, 1944, achieved nothing for their people. Many acted out of conviction. However, they have not earned more recognition and respect than any soldier who died faithfully and silently at the front for his homeland. The dead of the resistance groups did not risk or lose any less, but also not any more than those who fell in battle, their lives. The time finally arrived for me to report to Heinrich Himmler. The Major emphasized that I shouldn't mince words. Himmler appreciated when someone openly expressed their opinion, and I was to do just that during our conversation. The staff headquarters was in a villa where Himmler stayed when the train wasn't travelling. I had to check my briefcase at the entrance. Nobody asked me for my pistol. Before I was admitted, an SS officer briefed me one more time. Himmler was addressed simply as Reichsführer and not as Herr Reichsführer. Additionally, my hat had to be tucked under my arm before I entered. This contrasted with the Wehrmacht, where we reported to our superiors covered. Everything was understood, and we could begin. I had no illusions after everything I had heard about Himmler, and it didn't help that we had no great love for the SS either. I reported succinctly. Oberleutnant Carius, commander of the 2nd Company of the 502nd Heavy Panzer Battalion, reports as ordered following convalescence. It took some effort to omit the customary respectfully reports, and to address him directly without using the third person. Once in a while the power of convention scored a victory, especially during the conversation after the meal, but I didn't lose my composure. Himmler stood up. In the name of the Führer, I am presenting you the oak leaves to the Knight's Cross, which were awarded on July 27, 1944. The Führer extends an apology, as he has always personally presented the award until now. He is overburdened and has empowered me, as the Chief of Staff of the Replacement Army, to present the oak leaves to you and to extend his best wishes for a speedy and complete recovery of your health. I personally congratulate you from the bottom of my heart. You can certainly be proud, as you are the youngest bearer of this award in the entire army. Himmler approached me, shook my hand, and handed me the oak leaves in a case. He then said kindly, "We'll want to go over to dinner. The guests are probably already waiting. We will be able to converse in private after dinner." After a short military thank you, I placed the small box into my breast pocket and moved into the anteroom. However, Himmler was already next to me and said, "My dear Carius, that simply won't do. I'm going to introduce you shortly as freshly decorated after all. You will have to wear that around your neck for better or worse." He removed the paperclip that secured the Knight's Cross on the ribbon and added the oak leaves. He then tapped me on the chest and said, "That's probably your own invention. I will recommend it to my men. Some of them are also wearers of that kind of necktie." He was referring to the elastic band from the driving glasses, which could be comfortably worn around the neck regardless of size, especially practical with shirts. My first impressions of Himmler, whom his opponents called a bloodhound, pleasantly surprised me. I no longer felt apprehensive about the upcoming cosy conversation. Himmler and I went to the dining room, where approximately 15 to 20 men rose from their places. I was introduced to the entire group and given a seat to the right of Himmler. I quickly determined that the majority present were generals, along with a few civilians from the armaments industry. The conversations were extremely interesting for me. 2 SS generals had been ordered back from Yugoslavia to discuss additional measures intended to be taken there. The partisans were at odds with each other. The old animosity between Serbians and Croatians continued to exist and had long been exploited by our leadership. We supplied the Croatians with weapons and now sought to recruit them for our own use. A few civilians from the armaments industry highlighted that the main problem that had to be resolved soon was air defense. This was clear to anyone who had witnessed the devastation of our cities. I would have been glad to discuss this topic longer, especially since it was my only opportunity to learn whether a successful conclusion to the war was still possible. The meal was appropriately simple, given the times: soup, followed by meatballs, vegetables, and potatoes. In honor of the guest, the potatoes were peeled and not served in their jackets. Preserved pears concluded the meal. After finishing the first serving, I naturally wanted to stop. Himmler gestured to the orderlies, all SS Scharführers, and personally put more on my plate. He was in good spirits and said, "Eat up, Carius. You don't look like you need to hold back. On the contrary, you ought to gain some weight. Otherwise, a quick release from the hospital is not at all conceivable." To the laughter of all assembled, he pointed to a general who had already put on a little fat. "Carius, you have to put on at least half of that weight." Himmler wore a simple field grey uniform, without any piping or decorations. It amazed me that this man was supposed to be so dangerous. I thought anyone tasked with maintaining order behind the front in a country at war must be unpopular for being uncompromising. Coffee was then poured, and Himmler had it brought into his work area, where he resumed official discussions. It was notable that he neither smoked nor drank alcohol. As the guest of honour, I was given time to drink my coffee leisurely and smoke a cigarette. Then came the moment when I began my long conversation with Heinrich Himmler. Based on memory, I will attempt to render our conversation as accurately as possible. Himmler's work area was decidedly modest. The room was large, but I only recall a large desk against the right rear wall and a comfortable grouping of armchairs in the opposite corner. We sat down in a relaxed manner next to a small, round table. Later, I often thought about this conversation whenever it was said that one could never get close to the big men of the Third Reich. For half an hour I sat alone with Himmler at the table, at ease and armed. Our informal conversation began and remains vivid in my mind even today. After a few friendly introductory words, Himmler asked, "Oberleutnant Carius, do you believe that armour will soon be outmoded and eliminated by the development of handheld weapons?" I answered candidly, "Reichsführer, I do not share this opinion. You know that the Russians have used hunter-killer troops for a long time. They have almost never achieved anything, however, whenever our tanks were employed together and covered each other. If infantry was also present, it was difficult for anything to happen. The probability of a hit with bazookas and similar weapons at greater distances is very small. If the tank crews are alert, then soldiers with those weapons can definitely only shoot once. Hunter-killer teams have had an easy time of it with the English and the Russians when they drove with closed hatches. Our battalion, however, has only lost a single tank to this method. That was on the Newer. It was due to the stupid employment of a single Tiger, and it was our own fault. Besides, for our anti-personnel security, we also have 6 close-in mines on the turret. When needed, they can be set off from inside, but I've never needed to make use of them." Himmler had listened attentively and then suddenly changed the topic. "What do you think about the attitude of the people back home? You've certainly had the opportunity forced upon you to gain an impression here as well." I didn't feel one bit shy about this very direct question, and I said quite openly what I thought about it. "Reichsführer, there is no doubt at all that the people have become rather unnerved by the terror attacks. Everyone is waiting for a weapon that can knock this horrible enemy out of the air." I hesitated for a moment and then continued without concern. "Many people, myself included, are disgusted by the boastful speeches of certain party people who always act as if the war were already won and our final victory a given." Himmler now looked at me with great attentiveness. "In my opinion," I continued without hesitation, "our people have already shown that they are strong enough to discover the truth. They also know that we will have to continue to work hard to change the fortunes of war. Could it be arranged that experienced and decorated frontline generals occasionally come to Germany and talk to the people? These people enjoy more respect than the party people, who actually know nothing at all about the front themselves. Because of that, they only speak empty words, probably directed from higher up. Would Himmler blow up now, I thought to myself, after I had described certain party people in such a derogatory manner? Nothing of the sort. The Reichsführer SS answered quite calmly, "I am aware of the suffering of our people. I also know that the fundamental condition for our continued holding out has to be our new aerial defences. In a relatively short time, we will be able to prevent the Americans from flying in parade formation above us. Our new jet aircraft will soon be put into operation. New flak rockets, some manned and some radio-controlled, have already been tested. A little while ago, you sat at the table with the responsible gentleman. You are correct, my dear Carius. Without wide-reaching prevention of the bombing, we will not be able to hold out much longer, but all that will look completely different shortly." At that point, Himmler hesitated for a moment. "The prerequisite, to be sure, is that our fronts can be held at all costs for another year. We need this one uninterrupted year to finish the weapons that we're building to surprise the enemy." With these words, I thought about the old saying, "I hear the message fine, it's just believing it that's hard." but at the same time I glimpsed a ray of new hope. Himmler continued, "Concerning your criticism of the party leadership, I also have to admit you're right, Carius. You yourself know that the best people are at the front. I simply could no longer disapprove their requests to volunteer. When we win the war, and we have to win it, then we will soon remedy the abuses that prevail here right now. We will replace the incapable men with proven ones." He suddenly changed the topic again. "Wouldn't you like to switch to the SS? We are looking for young and proven people. In a few weeks you could be a Hauptsturmführer." Nothing was further from my mind than leaving my tankers. I answered promptly, "No, Reichsführer. My conservative background forbids me from abandoning the flag. I only want to return to my old company. I also don't intend to go active. I think that the rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the SS up to now has only had a negative effect for everyone. Without any reservations, we in the army recognize the great achievements of the SS at the front. But you also can't forget that the SS units have the best people and the best material. That is, they have continuously received preferential treatment. That's already frequently caused bad blood with the other units." Even these remarks didn't produce a rise from Himmler. "In regard to your worries about the rivalry between the Wehrmacht and the SS, I can tell you today that efforts have been underway for some time now to combine both forces. It should be noted that these efforts have continuously failed due to the stubbornness of the Wehrmacht generals." This remark by Himmler made me happy, because it proved to me that our generals really did have more backbone than one usually assumed. The introduction of the German greeting, or Nazi salute, after July 20th had already made me extremely upset. I hoped the generals would remain resolute. The SS could join us after all, since we were certainly there first, but many things indicated that the SS wanted to swallow the Wehrmacht. Himmler was already the chief of staff of the entire replacement army, which included all elements of the Wehrmacht. In that capacity, he had just given me the oak leaves. Himmler then began to talk about personal matters. "Do you have any personal wish that I can fulfill? Perhaps special leave or something similar?" I immediately requested a certificate from him that my duty status would be changed to return to duty after my return. I also requested that I should be sent immediately to my unit by the replacement battalion. Himmler smiled in disapproval. "That's really not going to happen, my dear Carius. I can't let you go back to the front for another 2 months. You can't finish yourself off before the end of the war. You have to recover for another couple of weeks or months in the replacement battalion. There is still enough time in the spring to return to your unit. You people at the front always want superbly trained replacements, but you never feel like training a few men yourselves." After a little give and take, I finally succeeded in receiving something in writing. In it, I was to be considered as capable of returning to duty effective January 1st, if I so desired, and I was to be transferred immediately to my old company if I didn't want something else. I was later able to use this piece of writing quite effectively. Our conversation drew to a close. Himmler asked me whether I was acquainted with Salzburg and its vicinity. When I answered negatively, he kindly placed a car and driver at my disposal. In departure, he reached out his hand to me and said, "If you should ever have difficulties any time or anywhere, please don't hesitate to write to me. You can turn to me at any time." With that, I was dismissed in good graces. I described my visit with Heinrich Himmler in such detail because he really surprised me. After the conversation in his staff headquarters, I gathered some hope for a successful conclusion to the war. That was after I had already considered a defeat almost certain. It doesn't matter what view one has of the Third Reich, the truth requires one to describe those men as they really were. I received a vehicle from Himmler for a short joyride. The driver introduced me to the wonderful region. He drove me to Berchtesgaden, to the tea house, which was commonly called the Eagle's Nest. Besides that, he also showed me the Obersalzberg mountain. I would have also enjoyed visiting my father, who was employed on the Yugoslavian border. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out his location, and didn't discover until after the war that I could have easily made that detour in 3 days. That would have brought me the greatest happiness back then. During the time I lived in the special train following my award ceremony, reports that came in from the front were constantly being discussed. The commander of the IV SS Panzer Corps, General Gilles, telephoned quite frequently. His corps had been brought back up to strength and was in reserve in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, right behind the front lines. Of course, that was extremely interesting for me. We discovered that the Russians had assembled massive forces in this area with which they wanted to start their big offensive. This later ended with the capture of Berlin, thanks to the Western powers who politely waited in place to give the Russians the honours. Hitler, however, did little justice to his title as the greatest commander-in-chief. In any case, his directives back then were more than unfortunate. For instance, he pulled panzer divisions out of the northern sector shortly before the Russian attack and moved them to the south, where we intended to initiate an offensive. According to Hitler's plan, this advance was supposed to cause the Russians to withdraw a portion of their forces to the south and thus spread themselves out. But they didn't do us the favour. The times had long since passed where Ivan was taken in by such manoeuvres. Unfortunately, the Russians knew what condition we were in. In any event, the divisions were shipped to the south and ordered to attack immediately. The result was that the Russians had an easy time of it. In some cases, the infantry attacked first without the tanks. In others, just the opposite occurred. Our attack in the south was repulsed, and the divisions were, for the most part, wiped out. Contrary to all strategic and operational dictates, General Gilles had to remain right behind the front. His corps was thus unable to deploy to the front after the Russian breakthrough. His units were immediately overrun during the initial Russian advance and drawn into the general confusion of the withdrawal. They were thus unable to bring their influence to bear. If the requests of Gilles and other commanders had been granted to move the corps farther to the rear in reserve, then these well-equipped men could have certainly stopped the Russians. Later, their advance couldn't be stopped anymore. The advance guard of the Russian tanks had already shown up at the gates of Kustrin in January. By then I had become acquainted with the region around Salzburg and waited for my return to the hospital. After 3 days, 2 SS officers who wanted to drive to Berlin gave me a ride. I was happy to be spared the long train trip. It was also nice that I had the opportunity to drop in on the Army Personnel Office in Berlin. I had to make do with the train afterward. On the trip from Salzburg to Berlin via Munich, I learned to appreciate the car radio, which I normally didn't care for much at all. That was because we could hear where low-flying planes were reported. Only because of that did some people escape being engaged. Whenever low-flying planes were reported, we drove under a highway bridge and waited until they had disappeared. We left our route from Munich to Berlin at the Autobahn exit in Halle and made a small detour to the Leuna synthetic oil facility. The SS officers had a meeting there with the top engineers of the plant. As far as I can remember, it concerned the moving of individual elements of the operation underground, for which technical difficulties still stood in the way. This visit to the Luna facility was very interesting for me. As is well known, and very understandable, the fuel production sites were always targets of the enemy's bombing raids. That shouldn't excuse the fact, however, that bombs were dropped arbitrarily and senselessly into the middle of the residential areas of the cities during the terror raids. While talking to Luna's directors, I discovered that the attacks were only expected whenever partial production resumed. If the factory was put out of commission, then the enemy bided his time. They waited until a portion of the facility had been restored enough by the tireless women and men who worked day and night until production was again possible. They could then count on the facilities being bombed to pieces right on the evening of the first workday. Because the enemy couldn't just produce the exact times of the reconstruction work out of thin air, it was crystal clear to everyone that the traitors had to be sitting in their own factory. Despite all precautionary measures and surveillance, however, they could not be discovered. Barrage balloons floated in the air all around the factory, which stretched on and on. But the Americans usually flew so high that the balloons didn't help at all. The flak also had little effect. The great height of the approaching enemy formations also had its good side, because the chance of a hit was much less. Unfortunately, the Americans were even informed about the effect of their raids. They continued to fly to their targets until they were successful with their bombs. Production had just started up again on the day of our visit. Because of this, the director recommended to us that we try to leave the area before the onset of darkness. Despite that, we stayed longer on our visit than we had planned. We had just reached the Autobahn when the enemy formations approached. We wanted to observe if what was said had been true. We stopped at the next overpass to see whether the Americans were once again in the know that day. It was a horrifying sight. Unfortunately, our workers were completely right. The bombers dropped their entire load on the factory, and we had the impression that this time they didn't need to fly any more missions. They had certainly done a great job. Our workers, as busy as bees, continued to partially rebuild the facilities despite everything. But that goodwill and industry couldn't help by themselves. The traitors were in the midst of them, as in other places, and the enemy could wipe out the entire tiresome labour in a few minutes. The trip to Berlin went without incident. I stayed at the apartment of the officer who had given me a ride in his vehicle. The first thing next morning, I headed for the Army Personnel Office. I wanted to extract marching orders to my old company from them. Even though I left my old man's walking stick outside the door, just like I had when visiting Himmler, I didn't succeed in realizing an immediate transfer to my old unit at the front. I wanted to circumvent the replacement battalion, but the staff officers were inflexible. They dismissed me politely but firmly. I took the train back to my hospital in Westphalia. The hospital was no longer in Lingen. That was because I had arranged to have myself transferred to a hospital in the area where my uncle was the chief surgeon. I was hoping to be able to achieve more there. At the same time, I was practically among family. I had been told to send a telegram before my arrival, but they didn't know me very well if they really hoped I would do that. The sister in charge of the kitchen had baked me a 3-layered cake, and we celebrated together in an intimate atmosphere. During my stay in both of the hospitals, I had become acquainted with the food provided by the nuns. I must say that all the wounded were enthusiastic about the rations. For example, even for Christmas in 1944, every hospital patient received half a chicken. Mark my words, every wounded man, and not just the officers, as spiteful people like to claim. The wonderful sisters performed superhuman feats. The hospital, as can be imagined, was overfilled. My uncle operated practically around the clock. The party functionaries in the area insisted on sponsoring an official celebration for me in the movie theatre. They intended to invite the public to it. I told them right away that such events didn't interest me at all, especially since everyone really had other worries at that point in the war. No one should count on my appearing. The heroes' ceremony was thus held on a small scale in an adjoining room of an inn. Only my fellow soldiers from the hospital and the friends of my uncle were present. The district leader also appeared with his following, but he left the gathering in a conspicuous manner after I had finished making my thank you speech. I shouldn't fail to mention that I had given an overview of the situation from my perspective in my speech. In the meantime, the enemy had come closer and closer to the western borders of the Reich. By December, we could see fully packed cars in Westphalia that had supposedly pulled back from the front. The men were usually so excited when reporting that one would think that the Americans were already just a few kilometers away. Of course, we had our own thoughts on the matter. Where was all of that supposed to lead? If all of the stragglers on the Western Front had moved back this far, then the Allies would soon be reaching the Rhine. In the meantime, the western districts had already been evacuated. I took advantage of the opportunity to visit my mother one more time for a little while after Christmas and helped her save a few things from home. On the return trip, I made another detour to Berlin. I checked to see whether there was any opportunity to get to East Prussia. My old company had landed there in the meantime. I had written to my comrades that I could walk quite well again and had been feeling strong enough to go to the front for some time, but that I had been hindered in doing so by the replacement battalion. On December 2nd, I received the following reply. Herr Lieutenant, with your wound, you can really consider yourself lucky that you are still among the living and don't have to be left out at the next census. When can we count on seeing you again in the company? It goes without saying that that would be the greatest Christmas present for the company. Of course, I thought the same thing as my terrific comrades. It upset me when the Army Personnel Office informed me that no more opportunities existed to get to East Prussia. The troops there were being brought back. It would thus be completely senseless to send me there. Instead, I was supposed to report to Paderborn. In the units that were being drawn up, they were missing officers with frontline experience. I would find a satisfying assignment there. I was very disappointed, of course, and quickly visited my brother, who was taking an officer candidate course in Krampnitz. When I arrived there, excitement was in the air. All the men in the course were getting ready to move to occupy the positions around Berlin. I was lucky because the next day I wouldn't have seen my brother anymore. It should be mentioned that the Russians had already surfaced a few days before at Kustrin. Hauptmann Fromme had quickly assembled a battalion out of all the available training tanks. If I had just shown up a day earlier, I would have been able to take over a company immediately because no suitable officer had been available. Hauptmann Fromme was a tough old soldier whom I already knew from earlier times. It was said that he had been demoted in peacetime because he had struck a commander due to a difference of opinion while under the influence of alcohol. This old go-getter had become an officer again during the war, starting at the bottom. By 1941 he had already received the Knight's Cross. Fromme showed the Russians at Kustrin that the way to Berlin wasn't yet completely open. He shot up the Russian armoured advance guard, thus preventing the Russians from obtaining the Oder crossings by surprise. At the hospital, I packed my suitcase quickly and left, as ordered, for Paderborn. The commander of the replacement battalion at Paderborn wanted to palm off a training company on me right away. I told him that I didn't feel confident with the training of a 300-man company. I wanted to be transferred to a combat unit that was being drawn up. He then became unpleasant. I remembered the correspondence that Himmler had given me. When I presented it to him, he abandoned his intentions. But then I had to wait around without doing anything until something suitable was found. The 3rd Company of the 502nd under Hauptmann Leonhard had been pulled out of Russia and was in Sennelager. The company had received the new King Tigers and was getting ready for combat. I saw my maintenance team there, along with Oberfeldwebel del Zeit, who continued to lead it with his old vigour. I also saw old familiar faces in the combat elements. Oberfeldwebel Zwetti was there as a tank commander, and Lieutenant Ruidel was a platoon leader. How happy it would have made me to have been transferred to my old gang, because there was still hope that this company would be shipped back to the battalion on the Eastern Front. The commander of the replacement battalion ruined those plans, however. He was just about through with me. By then, everything had already gone completely crazy. Everyone in the replacement battalion lived according to the questionable motto, "Enjoy the war, the peace will be terrible." This dissoluteness and all the senseless partying according to the principle of après nous le déluge was deeply repugnant to me. I wasn't the only one who thought that about the way they carried on, but our circle was relatively small. In any case, it was clear to me that I wouldn't stay long in Paderborn. The catastrophe was already casting its bitter shadows. Hauptmann Scher was the commander of the 512th Hunting Tiger Battalion. I was grateful to him for accepting me as a company commander. I had to disappoint the wounded from my old company. Although these men were lying around doing nothing, their transfer to the front was strictly forbidden by the commander of the replacement battalion. I regretted not being able to keep those men whom I knew and who were so tried and true. After a great deal of effort, I at least got Lustig as my personal driver. Our equipment situation was quite complicated. The Hunting Tigers came from the Hindenburg facilities in St. Valentin near Linz. The cannons, on the other hand, came from Breslau. The Russians had already advanced beyond that, however, so we were only able to equip 30 Hunting Tigers with cannons. Each company received only 10 vehicles. In the final analysis, that was sufficient, since we couldn't man any more. The ammunition was drawn from Magdeburg. The ammunition details that picked it up had radios with them to report every stop. Our employment was that important to the High Command. The tanks were transported by rail to Paderborn. The companies were assembled there in Sennelager. We had the impression that we were considered the secret weapon that could still save Germany. Because the vehicle parts were stockpiled in Dollersheim near Vienna, I had to commute the 1,000 kilometers between Paderborn and Vienna on a continuous basis. That wasn't a lot of fun in the dark and with the constant air raids. Although I drove with blackout lights, we had a lot of problems with the civilian population, which felt threatened. But how could I have covered that stretch if I had stopped for every air raid and waited for the all-clear signal? In Kassel, I once again had a lot of luck while making such a trip. We were in the middle of the city when the sirens suddenly started wailing. Everybody ran into the air raid shelter. My first sergeant, who unfortunately bore no resemblance to Hauptfeldwebel Riga, wanted to get out of the vehicle at all costs and disappear into a bunker. I didn't allow him to dissuade me and stepped on the gas to get to the edge of the city. We scarcely had the railroad crossing behind us when the bombs of our liberators were rushing through the air. Fortunately, the carpet bombing began farther to our right. The entire portion of the city where the first sergeant wanted to get out lay in ruins. Once again, I had had a sixth sense and was greatly relieved not to have paid attention to the requests of my Hauptfeldwebel. When the assault guns were calibrated in Sennelager, we experienced our first failure. Despite its 82 tons, our hunting Tiger didn't want to act like we wanted it to. Only its armour was satisfactory. Its manoeuvrability left a lot to be desired. In addition, it was an assault gun. There was no traversing turret, just an enclosed armoured housing. Any large traversing of the cannon had to be effected by movement of the entire vehicle. Because of that, transmissions and steering differentials were soon out of order. That such a monstrosity had to be constructed in the final phase of the war, of all times. A better idea for the travel lock of the 8-metre-long cannon of our hunting Tiger was also absolutely necessary. It had to be removed from the outside during contact with the enemy. Locking down the barrel during a road march was necessary, of course. Otherwise, the mounting brackets would have worn out too quickly, and exact aiming would have been impossible. All these problems were compounded by the fact that a tanker cannot feel comfortable in an assault gun. We want to be able to turn our weapons 360 degrees. If not, we have no feeling of security or superiority, but rather that someone is breathing down our necks. During the calibration, Stabsgefreiter Sepp Moser set up the targets in the countryside. From Passau, he was a man with a powerful body and a heart of gold. He was with the maintenance squad that had been withdrawn from Russia with the 3rd Company of our battalion and reorganized in Paderborn. Whenever Sepp took matters in hand, things worked. Moser drove a prime mover. In civilian life, on the other hand, he drove a beer truck. His wife took care of his correspondence with the laconic remark that otherwise the pen would break in his hands. I heard from another comrade, who saw Sepp again after the war in Passau, that he was content. He proudly noted that he got 30 litres of beer free every week. The comrade then asked him in amazement what he was able to do with all that beer. He received a classic reply to that question. Well, whatever I still need, I just have to buy for myself. Sepp Moser gave it his all during the calibration of the assault guns. We missed everything in such a manner that we were soon fed up with it. Finally, the ordnance technician checked the matter out, and everything then worked better. We discovered that the cannon, because of its enormous length, was battered about so much as a result of even a short move off the road that its alignment no longer agreed with that of the optics. That promised to be a lot of fun. Things didn't want to work before we even met the enemy. My company was the first to be loaded. On the last night, I gave my soldiers an evening pass, and was both amazed and overjoyed that no one was missing in the morning. Our goal was the train station in Siegburg. The almost panicky haste was understandable. We knew that the Americans had already crossed the Rhine at Remagen, after the bridge had fallen into their hands intact. In spite of the total chaos that already prevailed then, we had all of our things complete and together. That was an accomplishment all the same. 3 transport trains had been made available. The loading went according to plan because the enemy air force spared the train station in Sennelager for some unknown reason, although all our assault guns were assembled there. I preferred to drive in my vehicle to check out the new operational area before the arrival of my company. Due to the low-flying aircraft, of course, the transports only rolled at night. Using the Kubel, I had to drive up and down the rail line constantly, so that the trains didn't get held up too long. The tracks were frequently interdicted by the fighter bombers, which were a nuisance. There was hardly any air defense anymore. Besides, a strange attitude was prevalent. It could be summed up as follows: "Do anything but shoot! The pilots could discover our position." The ease with which the enemy fighters circled over us in broad daylight made me furious. We had no way to defend ourselves against them, however. The air superiority of the enemy was simply devastating. Because of that, during the day, our trains stayed in tunnels or along protective slopes where they weren't exactly safe. The field mess hadn't shown up yet, so I had to be a jack of all trades: driver, courier, transportation officer, and company commander, depending on the situation. Occasionally I could even get warm food for my men. Fuel and rations were readily available in the depots. They either fell into the hands of the Americans or were senselessly destroyed. When I finally knew for certain that the first transport would arrive in Siegburg in the morning, I drove ahead. I found out that the Yanks were already shooting as far as the loading ramp. That meant it could get lively. In Siegburg, after a long search, I found a former commander of the 502nd, Major Schmidt. He led the armour liaison staff in the West and was more than a little surprised to see me there. I actually had to sit down when Major Schmidt told me that he had no idea what was supposed to happen to us and where we were supposed to be employed. Then even crazier things happened. For instance, one of my motorcycle messengers appeared and proudly informed me that our first train was in the process of unloading in Duisburg. It was supposed to have gone to Siegburg, and it landed up in Duisburg. There had to be something fishy going on. I ordered the messenger to squeeze everything possible out of his machine so that he reached Duisburg before the empty train left again. Where was I supposed to get the special cars needed to load the vehicles again? The motorcycle messenger was able to get there, and the train in fact reached the area around Siegburg the next night. In the meantime, Major Schmidt had called around to all possible units and staffs. Even the commander of Army Group B, General Feldmarschall Model, didn't know about our planned employment in his area. I was ordered to report to him after the arrival of my vehicles. While waiting, I wanted to finally get some sleep. After all, who knew when I would get some peace and quiet again? I was just lying down on my wooden bed when a guard appeared and reported Oberleutnant Held to me. That was it for the sleep. Held was my platoon leader when I was a recruit. I hadn't seen him since 1941. I was very happy to be able to shoot the breeze with an old acquaintance. We talked the entire night. We couldn't unload in Siegburg because of the very heavy fire. We therefore let the first train stay in a tunnel until the onset of darkness and brought the vehicles onto the road during the night. Not a single wheeled vehicle was ready for action. All the tires had been shot up, and it took days until we had the supply trucks halfway in order. Intervention at Remagen was no longer a possibility because the Americans had already advanced across the Autobahn. The Yanks must have been really grateful to Hitler for creating these superhighways. If only we had found such roads during our advance into Russia. We then would have reached Moscow and not have remained stuck in the mud. At that point I was attached to General WWII. I had the 1st Platoon occupy positions in a little patch of woods right behind the front lines. I scarcely sat in a combat vehicle anymore because the individual assault guns were attached across the entire corps sector. I constantly drove from platoon to platoon, from hunting tiger to hunting tiger, and from regiment to direct the engagements. Soon the distances weren't very big anymore because the Ruhr pocket collapsed more and more upon itself. An incident occurred that proved to me how deeply the fighting morale among the men and the officers had sunk. My executive officer was pulling security in my hunting tiger in the piece of woods already mentioned. He had also taken my crew. Suddenly my driver Lustig approached me on foot halfway from the front lines. I already had a bad feeling. The good man was completely out of breath and had to catch it first before he could report to me what had happened. His first remark said everything. I almost slugged my tank commander just now. If we were still in Russia, he'd be dead now." He then explained what had happened. His vehicle was located with another hunting tiger, well camouflaged, at the wood line. A long column of enemy tanks had driven across their front at about 1.5 kilometers distance. Lustig now considered it a given that the tank commander would give the order to fire. Why else were our assault guns there? The man refused to fire a shot, however. A heated argument started among the members of the crew. This strange officer justified his refusal to fire with the reason that he would expose himself if he opened fire, and he would then draw the attention of the fighter bombers. To make a long story short, not a single shot was actually fired, although this distance was practically ideal for our cannons. The enemy would have had no opportunity to endanger our hunting tigers. It wasn't enough, however, that this strange officer didn't fire. He also ordered his vehicle to back up out of the woods shortly thereafter. It was then that he really did reveal his position. He was lucky that no planes were in the air at that time. He cleared out to the rear without notifying the vehicle commander of the second hunting tiger at all. That commander promptly followed, and both of them raced off as if the devil were behind them. Of course, no enemy was to be seen far and wide. Because of the careless driving of the completely inexperienced crew, the second vehicle was immediately disabled. The fearless Oberleutnant didn't worry about the vehicle at all. On the contrary, he obstinately drove on until his vehicle also became disabled. At least the Oberfeldwebel in the second assault gun blew up his own vehicle. Lustig had then departed on foot and insisted that I forward his report to my battalion. In that phase of the war, however, it didn't make any sense anymore. Everyone had to decide for themselves whether they wanted to experience the end decently or as a louse. Troops from all different branches were lying about in the woods by the hundreds, waiting for the end. Their morale was completely gone. In Siegen, I went to my battalion staff to report the situation to my commander. As I entered the command post, I was congratulated from all sides. The rumour had gone around, so it seems, that my guys had knocked out about 40 enemy tanks. I sobered them up when I made it known that we hadn't knocked out a single Yank, and we had 2 complete losses to show for it. Had only 2 or 3 tank commanders and crews from my company in Russia been there with me, then the rumour could have easily been true. All of my old comrades would have enjoyed firing up those Yanks on parade. 5 Russians were, after all, more dangerous than 30 Americans. We had already noticed that in the few days we had been employed in the West. In the meantime, it had become clear to us that we were completely encircled. The Ruhr pocket had been formed. Feldmarschall Model wanted to break through with all his forces at Marburg and escape the encirclement while there was still time. That would not have been difficult at all. The Supreme Command had a different opinion, however, and ordered us to hold out in the pocket for as long as possible. Our withdrawal route followed the Sieg River through Eitorf, Betzdorf, Kirchen. The first objective was Siegen, which was supposed to be held for a long time. A few assault guns had already become disabled on the road march. Despite good intentions, the inexperienced drivers were not able to master the situation in the mountainous terrain. The men really had a good attitude, but they had neither experience with heavy vehicles nor enough training. We encountered chaos everywhere. The roads were completely clogged, and the vehicles were easy prey for the enemy aircraft that completely dominated the skies. By means of handouts, the civilian population was requested by our leadership to abandon its domiciles and pull back with the troops. Only a small percentage followed this request. We had a hunch that our army intended to employ tabun, a new gas that promptly incapacitated the nervous system. The High Command had probably distanced itself from using it, because our own civilian population would have been wiped out, and even this weapon would not have turned the tide of the war. The majority of the civilians remained home and awaited the Americans. Of course, only a few of them believed in the silly fairy tale about the liberators, which had long since been refuted by the bombed-out ruins. But all desired the inevitable end to the dangers and the fears. After all, there were no Russians to be feared in the West, from whom the poor people in the eastern districts were fleeing in panicky fear in snow and ice. On the go around the clock, continuously hounded by fighters and bombers, That's how we reached Siegen. Although we hid the assault guns in barns or under straw during the day, another two were rendered combat ineffective by fighters and had to be blown up. How I envied those comrades who didn't have to experience this hopeless struggle during the last few weeks on the Western Front. In Siegen, I found a magnificent position on the high ground where the military posts were. From there, we had great fields of fire through a cut in the woods onto the road that led into the valley on the far side of the Sieg River. We waited for the Americans at this location, but we weren't granted any kills here either, even though I had remained in my assault gun to prevent a new failure. That was because the Yanks had Confederates among us. The civilians who had nestled into the dugouts on the opposite slope stopped the American vehicles before they came into our line of sight. I still wonder even today whether such a thing could be possible in another nation. I then withdrew my company toward Weidenau and covered the tank obstacle there. I set up my command post in the air raid bunker of a factory. I discovered from a civilian that a portion of the civilian population was cooperating with the enemy, while the other portion was cooperating with us. I didn't have any problem understanding that the people there were apathetic and tired of war, but that they would betray their own countrymen to the enemy I didn't want to believe at first. In the beginning, we had also let the people run to the Yanks if they wanted to fetch some things. We didn't check anyone who came back. I soon noticed, however, that the Americans always fired wherever one of my assault guns was located, even though they couldn't see the targets at all. From that point on, we naturally sealed off the main battle line. Practically all of our Keebles were disabled. We therefore decided one evening to fetch replacements from the Americans. No one should think that that was a heroic deed. The Yanks slept in the houses at night, as was proper for combat soldiers. Who was going to disturb them anyway? At the most, one sentry was located outside, but only if there was good weather. The war started in the evenings only whenever our troops pulled back and they followed. If, by chance, a German machine gun actually fired, then the Air Force was requested as backup, but not until the next day. Around midnight we departed with 4 men and returned after not too long of a time with 2 jeeps. It was convenient that we didn't need any keys for them. Only a small latch needed to be switched, and the vehicles were ready to start. Long after we had reached our lines again, the Yanks began to fire wildly in the air, probably to settle their nerves. If a night had been long enough, we could have easily driven to Paris. A small attack was planned for the next day, just east of Weidenau. It had the objective of taking high ground from which the enemy had too good of a view into our positions. Infantry was not attached to me, although foot soldiers were lying about in great quantities. What could we have done with men whose fighting morale had been totally extinguished? The enemy propaganda had worked with great success. Besides, there was something else. These units had been stationed in France for a long time, and the fear of this enemy and of being taken prisoner was, compared to the East, very minimal. Everyone thought that it only mattered to just appear to go the distance. Later, as we were pressed tighter and tighter into the pocket, we encountered hordes of former German soldiers who, according to their papers, had been properly discharged from the Wehrmacht. A quite clever city commandant had thought that the Americans would fall for such a trick. For the time being, however, the enemy snapped up all civilians, all the way from the junior in high school to grandpa. They assumed that there was a criminal behind every German. In reality, the hate directed against Germany was much more virulent than anything that our propaganda had ever formulated. Even the current atrocity stories can't alter that fact. We assembled for our small operation with 4 assault guns. Even though I could barely count on success, I intended to show the Yanks that, in any case, there was still a war on. The only evidence of that was in the ruins, of which they were perhaps still proud. We were used to an opponent the stature of the Russians. We were amazed at the contrast. During the entire war, I never saw soldiers disperse so head over heels, even though virtually nothing was happening. After all, what could we achieve by ourselves? We advanced a few hundred meters to the south and reached our objective. I finally recognized one enemy tank which drove wildly behind a house and disappeared. For once, I wanted to try out our 128mm cannon. I took a chance and fired at the house with a delayed fuse. The result showed us the monstrous penetrating capability of our cannon. After the second round, the American tank went up in flames. But what benefit were the best weapons in this phase of the war? The Yanks now came to life, of course, because someone was really shooting at them. We were soon in the middle of heavy artillery fire, and the bombers appeared to punish us. Fortunately, there were no casualties. At the onset of darkness, we withdrew back to our old lines because no infantry had showed up to occupy the new line. One of my assault guns became disabled when it landed in a bomb crater. The next day, the order arrived to withdraw the assault guns somewhat to the north and establish them in a better position to cover the road. Toward midnight, I had my company move out and followed later in my Keeble. Just as I wanted to pass the column, a terrible blast shook the air. Everything came to a halt, and I saw that an assault gun was burning. The crews ran into the countryside because they assumed that Americans could have infiltrated. I immediately had my doubts. Americans at night against tanks, and on foot. No, that was out of the question. Everyone was under cover, weapons at the ready. Figures then surfaced, and I recognized German helmets, among them some from the First World War. These hearty souls made their way forward carefully until I broke the spell and called out to them in German. It turned out that we had the last reserves in front of us, the Volkssturm. The men had never seen a German assault gun before, of course, and were firmly convinced that they had the bad guys in front of them. One of them finally got some nerve and fired a Panzerfaust. Both sides had gotten off easy. Finally, General Feldmarschall Model made me happy with the order to transport my hunting tigers to Unna. I had been complaining about insufficient fields of fire. I hoped to find that in the open plain between Unna and Wörl. We were still in the process of loading in Gummersbach when the Americans broke through at Weidenau. It was very difficult for us to get away. The rail lines were interdicted by the fighter bombers on an hourly basis, and the train personnel refused to take responsibility for the trip. Our men thus had to man the locomotives themselves. Using a small shunting engine, an advance force rode the rails to check them for their completeness. The condition of the railbed could change hourly. The Russians would never have given us so much time. But look at how long it took the Americans to liquidate a pocket where one can scarcely talk about any kind of serious resistance. A well-equipped force of German soldiers would have easily eliminated the entire Ruhr pocket in a week at the outside. I moved quickly with the reconnaissance platoon to Unna to check out the area and the operational possibilities. Unfortunately, there wasn't too much left of the good fields of fire that I had hoped to find there. Advancing from the east, the enemy had already taken Wörl. A strange city commandante was attached to the city commandant in Unna. Even the unit commanders we supposed to subordinate themselves to his directives. In reality, however, they scarcely took notice of this man who acted as if he were a great field commander. In any case, I had to report in to him. The command post was in the military reservation west of State Highway 233 and south of the Ruhr Highway. I finally found the entrance to the bunker. 30 steps led down into a deep cellar, which had probably been set up as an air raid shelter earlier. Above ground was a wet-behind-the-ears sentry who took his duties very seriously. At first he didn't want to give out any information. He finally confirmed, however, that the main headquarters was there. Downstairs I had to go through a dark passageway, where a sentry led me to the boss. When the door was opened, I couldn't believe my eyes. Sitting around a huge table covered with maps were numerous SS officers in magnificent uniforms, stylish and clean. A liqueur glass was in front of each of the gentlemen. In short, a unique type of command post. I reported and gave my combat strength. With the intonation of a practiced master of ceremonies, the commandant explained the situation to me. He showed me on the map where his positions around Unna were supposedly occupied, how many men were under his command, how magnificently Unna was fortified, and how impregnable it was. Of course, my 7 hunting tigers were also placed on the map immediately. I really didn't know whether to laugh or to cry. From the positions that were given to me, I could neither fire a shot nor see 50 meters, since they were located behind a railroad embankment. I had already driven around the area and sought out my position. With regard to my objections, the man in charge said jovially, "My dear friend, I think you'll find your way around soon enough. For the time being, the danger of an attack is most threatening from the east and the northeast. We'll show the Americans soon enough." I respectfully said "Jawohl" and made my way to get to some fresh air. When I opened the door, the young sentry came running in, all excited, and made the following report. "Impacting artillery in map sector XY." Outside, I asked the guard about his duties. According to him, he had to report the position of every impacting enemy round or bomb immediately. The Führer never came upstairs, not even to go to the bathroom. Everything was conducted in a comfortable manner from the telephone. What a difference from the SS units that we had seen in the East. At that point, at least, I knew that we could run the war there as we saw fit. I just had to make sure that our strange bird didn't fly out of his nest without me noticing it.